Sandor Clegane never forgot the blazing pain of fire against his flesh, nor the jeers and contempt of those who watched him grow into the monstrous dog of the Lannister household. Fear became his constant companion, etched deeper into his being than the scars that ran down the right side of his face. Even so, the Hound was more than a brutal sword hand. In the lingering aftermath of the War of the Five Kings, when Westeros still reeled from bloodshed and chaos, he found himself bound by neither house nor king. He was a man adrift, haunted by half-remembered dreams of decency, yet tethered to a life of violence. No matter how far he strayed, he could not outrun his own nature. He roamed the riverlands in the wake of the conflict, living off whatever he could hunt or scavenge, sometimes trading the protection of his blade for a roof and a hot meal. He told himself he wanted no part of the crowns and the petty lords who thirsted for them. He wanted no part of King's Landing, no part of the so-called wars for honor. Yet time and again, the threat of an empty belly or a roving band of brigands forced his hand. His reputation preceded him. Everyone knew the Hound, and those who didn't quickly learn to fear the man in battered armor with the savage hound's head helm. Still, he tried to find pockets of peace, away from lords and ladies and the intrigues that had once swept him up. But the roads of Westeros were filled with the remnants of war, stragglers and deserters, outlaws and forlorn peasants. Sooner or later, violence always found him. It was a chance encounter that shifted his path. One autumn day, a gang of Sellswords stumbled upon him. They called themselves the Gilded Boars, though their tarnished armor and leering faces suggested they were hardly noble. They recognized him immediately. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the man who had once served Prince Joffrey. Most were smart enough to show caution. Their leader, a short, broad-shouldered knight with stained boar sigils on his pauldron, thought he could make a name for himself by taking down the monstrous dog of House Lannister. It was a fool's notion. Sandor dispatched 2 men before they understood their mistake. He slashed through a third as easily as a huntsman culling a lame deer. With every blow, he felt the old fury surging in his blood, felt the raw satisfaction of steel-biting flesh. By the end of it, 5 corpses lay still among the fallen leaves, their warm blood painting the forest floor red. The short knight was alive but battered, crawling in the muck, one arm twisted unnaturally. When he pleaded for mercy, the Hound considered him through the slits of his helm. He almost turned away, almost left the man to die in the dirt. But he heard a shaky whisper that the Gilded Boars had been in league with remnants of the brave companions, those same bloody mummers who once terrorized the Riverlands under Vargo Hoat. The Hound felt the old disgust knot in his stomach. The brave companions had burned and pillaged, left villages in cinders. They had tortured innocents for sport. They had scoured the land, same as any plague. And though Sandor had seen more than his fair share of cruelty, the mummer's depravity curdled his blood in a special way. He demanded more information from the whimpering knight, who spilled everything in hopes of leniency. They were heading north to unite with a larger band, all sworn to petty lords or unscrupulous advisors, who claimed they had ties to the Lannisters or even the Boltons. Some said they still had men in King's Landing, lying in wait. The man promised gold, promised a place of honor if the Hound would only join them. The Hound spat at the very notion. In one swift motion, he ended the man's pitiful pleas with a dagger to the throat. After burying his blade in the man's neck, Sandor stared at the blood soaking into the soil. A bitter tang filled his mouth, the taste of old regrets. The memory of the burned village where he'd nearly died, the memory of Arya Stark's defiant eyes, the memory of Sansa's tremulous voice. These gnawed at him. He knew too well that men like the Gilded Boars and the brave companions would never stop terrorizing the weak. With the kingdoms in disarray, who was there to keep them in check? The Lannisters still held the Iron Throne, but the realm was fracturing at the seams. The Hound told himself he cared no more than any other Sellsword. He told himself it was better to mind his own hide. But the seeds of something else, anger, vengeance, even a warped sense of justice, were sown in his heart. The next time he encountered outlaws, his bloodlust simmered hotter. He was no knight, but he found himself cutting them down with a strange sense of purpose, as if each kill meant one fewer predator stalking the innocent. As autumn bled into winter, word spread of a fearsome warrior in the riverlands, a man who didn't shy from confronting marauders. Rumors painted him as a giant in dark steel, a savage with the cunning of a hound and the brutality of a cornered wolf. Some claimed he was a demon who devoured his foes. Others said he was the burned man, cursed by dragons. Still others whispered that it might be the Hound, loyal to no one, unstoppable with a sword. Occasionally, travelers left offerings in the road, a small bag of coin or a basket of bread. Some left simple messages scrawled on scraps of parchment, begging for him to protect their villages. He knew that if the truth of his identity became widespread, lords both near and far might seek him out. They would either try to hire him or kill him. Yet a small, spiteful part of him found grim satisfaction in seeing the fear in the eyes of men who once might have jeered at him in a different era. One evening, while warming himself by a meager fire, he thought of King's Landing, of the Red Keep, of the Iron Throne. He thought of Joffrey, the vicious brat. He thought of the Lannisters, who had used him as a tool for so many years. He remembered leaving the city during the Battle of the Blackwater, unwilling to face the wildfire that licked at the walls. Coward, some called him, but he knew it was no simple fear that made him run. It was the memory of his flesh burning, the memory of how no one saved him from the flames long ago. The notion that he might one day return to that city was laughable. And yet, in the lonely hush of the night, a new thought formed, unbidden and fierce. If scum like the brave companions or the gilded boars could carve out petty fiefdoms in the chaos, why couldn't he do something bigger, something that would shake them all to their core? Anger still guided him, but it was no longer directionless. In the weeks to come, he wandered with more purpose. The nights grew longer, but so did his ambitions. In a hamlet near Fairmarket, he encountered another band of outlaws. This time, they wore no sigils, but spoke with the same cruel arrogance he'd heard in Lannister soldiers who loved to terrorize the small folk. When he slew them, a group of peasants cautiously approached him. One of them recognized him, though he kept silent at first. Wordless, the peasant handed him a water skin and bowed his head. The Hound accepted the water and considered the group. Their eyes shone with a desperate hope. They were ready to beg him to stay to protect them. The Hound said nothing at first, but the memory of their gratitude and fear tugged at him long after he departed. He began to see the shape of an idea. Westeros was full of scattered armed men, many of whom had fought in the War of the Five Kings or served some lord who ended up dead or powerless. They were men without a cause, hungry and angry. Some of them turned to banditry, but others might be willing to follow a strong leader for the chance at a better life. The Hound, cunning in his own coarse way, started to gather them. He tested them by picking fights with local brigands, with unscrupulous sellswords. Any man who proved his worth in battle without indulging in needless cruelty earned a place at his side. In the beginning, only a handful joined, uncertain whether to trust the burned man in the old dog's helm. But soon, stories spread that this harsh warrior demanded discipline from his followers, punishing those who harmed the innocent or committed rape. He killed more than one man who disobeyed him, making an example so grim that the rest learned quickly. Though Sandor was no knight, no gentle savior, he recognized the difference between necessary violence and wanton cruelty. He hated knights for their hypocrisy, yet ironically found himself enforcing a stricter code than many so-called true knights had ever bothered with. Word of his small host spread, first among the desperate, then among smaller lordlings who found themselves lacking any real power in the chaos. Knights with tarnished reputations but a vestige of chivalry sought him out. Peasants flocked to him, offering their meager harvests and building rudimentary fortifications if it meant the Hound's men might protect their villages from pillagers. At first, this new coalition was hardly what one might call an army. They had no shining armor, no grand banners. But they had the heart of men who had lost everything, or men who had seen the worst of the war and wanted to carve out a different fate. As the riverlands shook off the final pangs of winter and the snows melted into muddy roads, the Hound's following grew. He was a reluctant leader. He drank too much at times, snapped at his closest advisors, and showed open contempt for any formality. When the men asked what their cause was, his answer was always the same: to keep scum from running this bloody kingdom into the ground. Some looked confused, but many had seen firsthand what scum with power could do. And so they followed, partly out of fear of their commander's prowess, partly out of hope that this new order might protect them from being at the mercy of highborn lords who viewed them as expendable chaff. Gradually, Sandor's ragtag host began conquering pockets of territory. He would hear of a tyrannical lord who had abused his peasants, or a band of sellswords terrorizing a crossroads village. The Hound would march there with a portion of his men and deliver a brutal lesson. If the local lord yielded and agreed to certain terms, no more torture, no more raping or pillaging, he could keep his seat, but as a vassal to the Hound's newly formed power. If the lord refused or tried to betray them, Sandor would burn them out, ironically using fire as a weapon against the vile. Perhaps it was half-mad to employ the very element he feared above all else, but he found a cold satisfaction in turning that terror upon those who might deserve it. Before long, stories of the Hound's black banners trickled south. King's Landing, under Queen Cersei's tenuous control, heard rumors of a rebel force led by Sandor Clegane. At first, they dismissed the idea that a single man, especially a disgraced dog, could pose a real threat. But the messages kept coming, each more troubling than the last. The Hound wasn't just leading a band of cutthroats. He had garnered the loyalty of small folk, lesser knights, and disenfranchised lords. He was forging alliances with men who had no love for the Lannisters or their allies. On top of that, rumor claimed he had proven unstoppable in battle, leading from the front. The man had always been dangerous. Now, he had ambition, or at least a savage sense of justice. When word reached the Red Keep that the Hound's forces had defeated 2 minor Lannister garrisons in the Riverlands, the mood turned grim. Cersei's hold on power was already shaky. Dorne simmered with unrest, the Iron Islands had their own designs, and the North was an unsteady ally at best. She could ill afford a new threat rising from the Riverlands. Cersei dispatched a formidable group of knights, along with a detachment of gold cloaks, to root out Sandor Clegane. Their leader was Ser Balman Leford, a well-respected military mind, accompanied by veterans of the last war. They marched north from King's Landing, hoping to catch the Hound unprepared. But the Hound had spies and sympathizers everywhere. Peasants, innkeepers, even a few low-level Lannister turncloaks who believed they were better off betraying a queen they despised. He knew the royal forces were on the move. He set an ambush near an abandoned mill on the banks of the Blackwater Rush. When Ser Balman's column arrived, it found the bridge was out. They had to reroute through a narrow ravine lined by steep, wooded slopes. Sandor's men waited in the brush. Rocks tumbled first, spooking the horses, then arrows rained from both sides. The Lannister knights tried to form up, but the terrain worked against them. By the time the Hound and his foot soldiers charged in, swords drawn, the royal force was already reeling. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Ser Balman fought valiantly, but he was cornered by the Hound himself. The gold cloaks broke, fleeing into the woods. Sandor disarmed Ser Balman and offered him a chance to yield. The proud knight spat blood, refusing to bow to a dog. Sandor shrugged and swung his long sword, taking the knight's head with one clean strike. Another rumor was born that day. The Hound's brutality was matched only by his sense of fairness, for he had at least offered Balman a surrender. The crows feasted for days on the corpses in the ravine. Sandor ordered his men to bury or burn the rest. He kept the Lannister flags. He nailed them to a wooden post as a message to the next wave that might come. Word of Ser Balman's defeat spread quickly, sending shockwaves through King's Landing. The court reeled with the news that the Hound had effectively shattered a detachment of the Crown's forces. Whispers circulated among the nobles that Sandor Clegane was no longer a mere nuisance. He was a genuine threat. Some even dared say that perhaps he would march on the city itself. Cersei responded by tightening her hold, raising new levies, demanding the lords of the Crownlands to contribute to the defense of King's Landing. She pored over strategies, ignoring the counsel of Pycelle's successor or the timid advice of lesser courtiers. She recalled Ser Robert Strong, her undead champion, rumored to be Gregor Clegane's reanimated corpse, to the capital. If anyone could stop the Hound, it would be the mountain that rides, no matter his current state. The Queen's decision left many uneasy. The hush that fell over the Red Keep at the mention of Ser Robert Strong's name was telling. They feared the silent giant as much as they feared Sandor Clegane. In the Riverlands, the Hound's army swelled with each victory. Men came from the Westerlands, the Reach, even from the Vale, hearing that the Hound was forging a new order, one that promised a chance to fight against corruption. Some were idealists, others mere opportunists. Sandor had no illusions about the latter, but he accepted anyone who could follow orders and keep their baser impulses in check. A man who indulged in cruelty would find himself facing Sandor's blade soon enough. Over time, black Houndhead banners were stitched and carried by the ranks. No one quite knew if the Hound liked or despised those banners. He sometimes glared at them, as if seeing the symbol of his own scarring. But he let them be, for they instilled unity among the men. As the roads became more secure under his patrols, local peasants revered him in a way he never expected. They offered him fresh bread, salted fish, even the occasional cask of ale. Children would peek around corners, hopeful for a glimpse of the famed burned man who was said to keep them safe. He snarled at the notion of being anyone's hero, but he did not turn them away. On rare nights, when he dozed by the fire, he dreamed of Sansa Stark singing soft songs, or Arya Stark glaring at him with that defiance in her eyes. He wondered if they would think him less a monster if they saw how he was trying to keep the worst predators at bay. Then he would awaken with a scoff, dismissing the fancy. He had no illusions about redemption. He was what he was, a hound, fangs bared. Despite his growing power, the Hound had never truly entertained the idea of seizing the Iron Throne itself. It seemed absurd. Kings were highborn, anointed by the faith, swaddled in decades of tradition. Sandor was none of those things, but the tides of war and the growing failings of the Lannisters changed the shape of his ambition. When a group of renegade knights from the Westerlands approached him, claiming that their bannermen would rather follow him than Cersei, something clicked. He realized that removing the Lannisters from power might be the only way to truly break their stranglehold on the realm. The small folk he'd been protecting begged him to press on, to march to King's Landing and tear out the roots of corruption once and for all. He was reluctant. The city brought back too many memories, too many nightmares of fire. But every day that his men grew in number, every day that he heard fresh stories of how the Crown's men abused the people in the name of the Queen Regent, the more he felt a grim inevitability pressing on him. He reached out, sending covert riders to houses that might align with him. Some were shockingly receptive. House Tarly in the Reach still reeling from internal strife, House Frey diminished and in disfavor, House Bolton in the north weakened by their own cruelty. The Riverlands themselves had many lords who had lost trust in the Iron Throne after the Red Wedding. Though not all responded kindly, enough had grievances or ambitions of their own. The Hound's messengers came back with cautious alliances or at least neutrality. The general sentiment was this: if the Hound marched on King's Landing, these lords would not hinder him, and some might even throw their support behind him, if he proved he could win. In King's Landing, Cersei's paranoia grew daily. She strengthened the city's defenses, stockpiled wildfire, and had Qyburn expand the production of alchemical devices. She installed more scorpions and catapults along the walls, recalled Lannister soldiers from afar, and demanded levies from the Crownlands. The city seethed under the weight of her demands. The poor starved, taxes rose, and a plague of discontent spread through the streets. Whispers circulated of a champion from the Riverlands who might liberate them. The faith militant, re-empowered for a time, was divided. Some among them called the Hound a demon who once served the Lannisters. Others believed the Hound might be an instrument of the Seven to punish the wicked. Tension simmered, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came in the form of Gregor Clegane, Ser Robert Strong. In a show of force, Cersei paraded her champion through the streets, letting the common folk see the towering monster in full armor. Instead of quelling discontent, it inflamed it. Rumors abounded that he was Gregor's corpse, that Qyburn had performed blasphemous arts. People began calling him the Undying Mountain. They said that if the Hound were to march on the city, it would be brother against brother. Two monstrous Cleganes clashing for the fate of the realm. Sandor's marches became more resolute. He led his forces through the Riverlands, subduing any Lannister outriders, forging alliances with local lords. He liberated towns from men who wore the Lion Sigil. His name became a rallying cry. The Hound is coming! Meanwhile, his second-in-command, a grizzled knight named Ser Brenner of the Cold March, coordinated supply lines and negotiated small treaties. Some men in the Hound's army questioned if they truly had the resources to besiege the greatest city in the realm. The Hound's stare was answer enough. He was tired of half measures. King's Landing had to fall, or everything they'd done would be for nothing. As spring arrived in earnest, the Hound's banners blackened the horizon on the roads leading to King's Landing. Thousands of men marched under his command, some equipped with better arms now, courtesy of smithies in Harrenhal and Riverrun, others wearing mismatched armor stripped from Lannister corpses. He had archers, spearmen, and a handful of cavalry. They were no disciplined host like the Tyrells or the Unsullied of old, but they had heart and they had their fearsome leader riding at the front, clad in battered plate and that snarling dog's head helm. As they approached the Crownlands, they met pockets of resistance. Cersei had dispatched more men to harass their flanks. Minor skirmishes broke out near hayfields and along dusty roads. One by one, the Loyalist forces fell back, often after stiff fighting. The Hound, though, wasted no time in pursuit. He drove forward relentlessly, ignoring the entreaties of some lords who begged for caution. His confidence was at an all-time high, though laced with the knowledge that King's Landing was heavily fortified. The final push would be no simple matter. When they arrived at the outskirts of the city, they found the gates closed and the walls bristling with archers. One of Cersei's top commanders, Ser Jordan Follard, stood upon the battlements, shouting that Sandor Clegane was an oathbreaker, a traitor, a coward who had fled the Battle of the Blackwater. He demanded the Hound turn back or be burned alive by wildfire. The Hound removed his helm, letting the city see his burned face. He bellowed back that he was here to topple the false queen, to end the cruelty that choked the realm. Any man who threw down his arms and opened the gates would be spared. The reply was a volley of arrows, which his men took behind hastily raised shields. A siege began. The Hound's forces built makeshift siege towers, battering rams, and ladders. They scouted the city's weaknesses, tried to woo the gold cloaks inside to switch sides. Some of them did, slipping out at night to join the besiegers, but many stayed loyal to the queen, or at least to their pay. Cersei, from within the Red Keep, ordered small-scale sorties to sabotage the siege lines. Explosions of wildfire lit up the night more than once, incinerating entire camps of men. The green flames reminded Sandor of his old terror. He felt the same pounding in his head, the sweat on his brow, the dryness in his mouth. Yet he forced himself to stand firm, to watch those flames. He could not conquer his fear of fire if he was to conquer King's Landing. On some nights, he stood guard in full view of the city walls, letting the flames reflect in his dark eyes. The men whispered that the Hound was courting madness. Days turned into weeks, the toll on both sides mounting. Disease threatened in the besiegers' camps. Hunger loomed in the city. The small folk inside King's Landing began to riot. Cersei responded harshly, sending the gold cloaks to quash any sign of rebellion within the walls. More innocents died. Across the city, the pleas of the desperate grew louder, and as news leaked out, the Hound's determination only solidified. He demanded an all-out assault to end it quickly. Some of his advisors argued for patience to starve the city out, but the Hound refused to let the people starve. He didn't fight this war to watch children wither behind walls. He gave the order. At dawn, they would storm the gates and the walls. They would either take the city or die trying. At the break of dawn, a horn sounded through the besieging camps. The men readied their ladders and battering rams. The Hound led from the front, as always. Clad in his blackened armor, he rode a massive warhorse toward the gatehouse, a group of hardy knights and footmen flanking him. Arrows whistled from the ramparts, but the archers found difficulty aiming at the swiftly moving riders. Ladders slammed against the walls. Men began to climb. Boiling oil and pitch poured down. Screams filled the air. The chaos of battle enveloped King's Landing's defenses. The Hound dismounted before the main gate, brandishing a colossal battering ram. He spurred his men to heave it forward. It crashed into the fortified doors with echoing booms. Time after time, they slammed it, each strike reverberating in Sandor's teeth. Defenders hurled stones, fired crossbows. Men fell around him, but he pressed on, ignoring the pain of a crossbow bolt that pierced his shoulder. Finally, under the relentless pounding, the great gates splintered. With a final blow, they gave way, revealing the chaos within the city streets. The Hound let out a roar, tearing the bolt from his shoulder and bellowing for his men to charge. They flooded into the streets, engaging the gold cloaks who formed desperate shield walls. Some defenders threw down their weapons at the sight of the raging Hound. Others stood and fought, compelled by duty or fear of the Queen. The city erupted into a full-scale melee. The Hound's men, spurred by weeks of siege and the injustices they'd witnessed, advanced with savage determination. Street by street, district by district, they gained ground. All the while, the Hound pushed toward the Red Keep, the seat of power. He knew that was where Cersei would be. If he ended her rule, the city might yield. More gold cloaks and Lannister house guards tried to block him at every turn. Yet, with every clash, the Hound battered them aside. Blood dripped from his armor, from shallow cuts on his arms and legs, but he never ceased. Around him, the black banners advanced. When they reached the hill leading up to the Red Keep, a figure emerged. A giant in full plate, gilded and grotesque, with a massive two-handed sword resting on his shoulder. Ser Robert Strong, the rumored abomination. He stood silent at the top of the slope, his visor concealing whatever horror lay beneath. In a rasping voice that seemed to echo from hollow lungs, he uttered a single challenge: Sandor Clegane. The Hound stared up at the hulking shape. His blood pounded in his ears as old memories of his brother, Gregor, flickered through his mind. It had been a lifetime since they'd faced each other. Whether this was truly Gregor's corpse or some twisted conjuration by Qyburn, he could not say. But he saw the same malevolent aura in this silent giant. He clenched his sword, ignoring the throbbing ache in his wounded shoulder. Ser Robert Strong descended the slope, sword raised, clearing a swath of space as men scrambled away from him. The Hound advanced, his breath steaming in the cool morning air. Their blades met with a deafening clang, each strike sending shudders through onlookers. The rest of the battle paused around them, as if the entire city held its breath for this clash of monstrous Cleganes. Sandor fought with grim, desperate skill, each blow fueled by a lifetime of hatred and fear. Ser Robert Strong's strokes came slow but devastatingly powerful, nearly wrenching the Hound's sword from his grip more than once. Minutes felt like hours as they exchanged blow after blow, the ring of steel echoing across the blood-stained courtyard. The Hound bled from multiple gashes, panting through gritted teeth. The monstrous knight showed no signs of pain or fatigue, as if he were indeed an unfeeling corpse. His next strike hammered Sandor's shield, splintering it. The Hound fell back, staggering. A memory of fire, of his brother pressing his face into flames, flashed through his mind. Rage flared white-hot in his chest. He roared and threw the remnants of his shield aside. He lunged, two-handed, slamming his sword into the giant's neck joint. The blade crunched through plate and lodged into unseen flesh beneath. Ser Robert Strong made a terrible, gurgling noise, swung blindly, and caught Sandor in the ribs with the edge of his gauntlet, sending him reeling. But the Hound refused to relinquish his grip on the sword. He twisted with a savage grunt, leveraging every ounce of his strength. With a sickening tear, the undead knight's head and helmet parted from its shoulders, rolling across the stones. What lay beneath that visor, no one could fully see in the chaos, but some swore they glimpsed a rotting mass of pale flesh before it toppled. The massive body sank to its knees, finally collapsing in a heap of clattering metal. A hush fell over the courtyard, broken only by the labored breathing of Sandor Clegane. He tore free his sword, staggering backward. Blood trickled from his side, and he spat onto the ground near the headless corpse. A roar of triumph erupted from the Hound's men. Gold cloaks who had been wavering suddenly lost all heart to fight, witnessing the downfall of their most terrifying champion. They either fled or threw down their arms. Sandor, gasping, fought the urge to collapse on the spot. He raised his sword toward the Red Keep, glaring at the last defenders who guarded its gate. "Open it," he snarled, "or by the gods, I'll tear it down brick by bloody brick." Fearful of sharing Ser Robert Strong's fate, the guards opened the gates. The Hound's men surged into the castle. Inside, the corridors echoed with shouts and clashing steel as loyalists made a final, frantic stand. But the Hound's victory outside had broken their spirit. Room by room, hall by hall, they were disarmed or cut down. Eventually, the Hound himself, flanked by a handful of his fiercest warriors, strode into the throne room. The high, vaulted ceiling was lit by torches that cast long shadows across the walls. At the far end, the Iron Throne loomed, a spiked monstrosity of swords. Cersei Lannister stood before it, clad in black and gold, her face set in a mask of regal disdain. Behind her, a few members of the Queen's Guard remained, forming a nervous shield around her. Sandor paused at the threshold, panting and wincing at his wounds. He looked upon the throne he had never wanted. He fixed his eyes on the Queen who had tormented Sansa Stark, who had unleashed the Mountain on so many innocents, who had let Joffrey run wild. The hush was broken only by the crackle of flames and the footsteps of the Hound's men as they surrounded the hall. For a moment, no one spoke. Cersei's voice rang out, high and imperious. "Dog," she spat, "come to bark at your betters?" A tremor in her tone betrayed her fear, but she lifted her chin, determined to maintain control even in the face of doom. Sandor took a step forward, leaning on his sword. "You're better?" he repeated, his voice low and ragged. "Bitch, I've torn down your walls, shattered your knights, and cut the head from your champion. You think you're my better?" She glared at him, lips curling. Her eyes flicked to the corners of the hall, seeking any last shred of support. But her men were outnumbered, and the Hound's army thronged the throne room, ready to strike at her command. She forced a mirthless laugh. "You think you can rule this city? You think the realm will accept a burned dog as king?" Sandor turned his gaze to the Iron Throne. "I don't give two shits about acceptance. I'm here to break the wheel of scum like you, who think the throne gives you the right to butcher and lie." He looked at Cersei with a fury that boiled over from years of serving her vicious spawn. "You've got two choices, yield or die." He raised his sword, ignoring the screaming protest of the wound in his side. The Queen's Guard tightened their formation around her. Cersei's eyes darted between them, and for one moment, she seemed on the brink of some final, desperate stand. Then she seemed to remember what had happened to Ser Robert Strong. She swallowed, her pride warring with self-preservation. Before she could speak, one of the Queen's Guard dropped his sword and knelt. The others exchanged glances, then followed suit, leaving their queen alone, trembling with rage and despair. "What good is a kingdom run by a savage who cowers at the sight of fire?" she sneered, even as defeat trembled in her voice. "Do you truly think you'll keep it?" Sandor bared his teeth in a humorless grin. "I'll do what I have to." He gestured to his men. "Take her, put her in a cell. She'll answer for her crimes later. Anyone who resists, kill them." A pair of knights from his retinue seized Cersei by the arms. She shrieked, struggling, cursing them all. But there was no audience left to save her. The Hound turned his back on the scene, the ghosts of the past swirling in his mind. He sheathed his sword and walked toward the Iron Throne. The throne loomed like a twisted mass of iron, blades hammered together by the Targaryens of old. He thought of how many had died to sit on it. He almost spat on it in disgust. Then, with a weary breath, he set one armored foot on the steps leading to that seat of power. He ascended, step by step, each movement sending jolts of pain through his battered body. At the top, he stood before the seat and glared at it as if it were an old enemy. The metal spikes reached out in all directions, like the talons of a monstrous bird. His reflection stared back at him in the polished steel of a half-melted blade. In the hush of the throne room, broken only by the rustling of his men and the ragged breathing of survivors, Sandor Clegane slowly turned and sat. The metal pressed against his back and shoulders, cold and unforgiving. He set his bloody hands on the arms of the throne, wincing as the jagged edges bit into his skin. A hush fell across the hall. The black banners of the Hound hung limply where Lannister standards once draped. Men who had followed him through the gates, who had believed in his savage promise, lowered to one knee. Others stood in stunned silence. None cheered. It was not that kind of victory. It was a moment thick with uncertainty, overshadowed by the savage truth of their conquest. Sandor's eyes swept the room. He saw fear, saw awe, saw the flicker of hope in some. For a moment, he recalled Sansa Stark's naive dreams of a gallant king. He recalled Arya's blunt desire for justice. He remembered how the small folk had cheered for knights at tournaments, not knowing the devils who hid beneath shiny armor. He swallowed, ignoring the taste of blood on his tongue. "It's done," he growled. "The Lannister bitch is dethroned." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Some men dared to speak. "Long live the king?" The words felt strange in the air. Sandor grimaced. He had never wanted to be a king. But here he was on the Iron Throne, with the city beneath his boot, and the realm looking to him for what came next. In the days that followed, the Hound solidified his control over King's Landing. He commanded that the gold cloaks surrender or be expelled. Many switched allegiance. Some fled into the night, wanting no part of a new regime. The city's gates were opened, and the battered remains of his army marched in. Patrols were set to prevent looting, though some looting inevitably occurred. Thieves lost their hands if caught. A harsh new discipline took hold. The small folk watched warily, unsure if this new king would prove any better than the old one. Sandor had no illusions. He was no saint, and he had enough sense to know that fear alone wouldn't hold a city. To that end, he relied on allies who had supported his cause from the Riverlands, from minor houses. He appointed them to administer the city's daily affairs, commanding them to keep the peace or face his wrath. He had Cersei locked away in the dungeons, along with any highborn Lannisters who hadn't fled or been killed. He entertained emissaries from the Reach, the Vale, the Westerlands, each unsure of how to approach this new occupant of the Iron Throne. His terms were simple, delivered with blunt force. "I'm not here to dance and feast. Bend the knee or get out of my sight. If you cross me, I'll burn your holdfast to the ground." Some lords took offense. Some recognized the precarious position of a realm exhausted by war. A few tried to test him, sending covert assassins into the city. The Hound's men rooted them out, piling corpses at the foot of the Red Keep as a warning. Slowly, grudgingly, the lords realized that this was not a Game of Thrones they could easily manipulate. Sandor Clegane did not play by their rules of courtesy or subterfuge. He ruled with direct honesty, using fear when necessary and an unexpected sense of fairness when it suited him. In those early weeks, the greatest challenge was not the lords but the small folk. The city had too many mouths to feed and not enough food. Winter was receding, but the harvest was still far off. Grain shipments from the Reach were uncertain, as the Tyrells had their own concerns. Starving mobs roamed the streets, desperate. Sandor ordered his men to distribute whatever stores they could find in the Red Keep and the granaries. But it wasn't enough. The people clamored, eyeing him with resentment and suspicion. He knew that if he did not address this, King's Landing would soon be a city of riots. So he struck a deal with the Reach, promising them leniency for certain transgressions if they sent grain and supplies. A contingent of his battered soldiers was dispatched to escort the shipments back. Though some shipments were lost to brigands, enough arrived that the city began to stabilize. Still, unrest simmered. Sandor walked the streets himself, unafraid to confront the people's anger. He had no charm, no polished words, But he had honesty, and he met their complaints with a blunt promise. I won't let you starve if you work. I won't let you be preyed on if you keep the peace. But if you try to tear the city apart, I'll put you down like rabid dogs. Strangely, many respected him for his directness, especially compared to the hollow platitudes of previous monarchs. Over time, they saw that, under his watch, crime actually declined. The brutal thieves, rapists, and killers that once thrived under Joffrey's rule now found themselves facing a swift, merciless justice. The new black-cloaked guards enforced a code more rigid than the old gold cloaks. Some whispered that it was better to live under a harsh, honest hand than a gilded tyranny. Word spread through the realm that King's Landing was under the Hound's rule. The Tyrells hesitated, uncertain whether to mount an offensive or negotiate. The Martells of Dorne watched with interest, for they had long hated the Lannisters. The North, embroiled in its own troubles, sent cautious envoys. Sandor received them all in the throne room, seated uncomfortably on that hideous seat of swords. He cared little for pleasantries, often cutting straight to the point. Will you treat with me or not? Over time, an uneasy patchwork of alliances began to form. The realm was weary of war, and many realized that continuing to fight a man who had the capital and its armies at his back was more trouble than it was worth. The major sticking point came from the Westerlands, where Kevan Lannister's supporters tried to rally. But Kevan had died some time ago, and the region was fractured. A handful of Lannisters took up arms, vowing to avenge their queen. The Hound's solution was swift. He sent a large force west, commanded by some of his most loyal officers, to subdue the last vestiges of Lannister power. Skirmishes erupted around Casterly Rock. Eventually, the rock fell to a siege, and the gold mines that had once funded Lannister might pass into the Hound's control. With the Westerlands pacified, the final resistance crumbled. Cersei, rotting in a cell, had few allies left who dared to press her claim. Despite these victories, Sandor felt no joy. He had expected to find some sense of justice in dethroning the Lannisters, in cutting down those who tormented the weak. Yet the burden of ruling weighed on him like a yoke of iron. Each day brought new complaints, new squabbles among lords, new demands from the people. He hated the labyrinth of politics, hated the petty manipulations that never ceased. Some nights he drank alone in the Red Keep, longing for the simple brutality of the road. Yet he did not abandon his throne. Perhaps a part of him believed that if he walked away, the realm would sink back into the same rot. His presence at court was neither graceful nor refined. Courtiers learned not to approach him with trivialities. Petty flatterers found themselves scorned or worse. A famous singer tried to compose a ballad praising King Sandor's mercy, but the Hound had no patience for it. "I'm not a fucking hero," he growled, throwing a cup of wine at the minstrel, drenching him. "Sing your lies somewhere else." Rumors circulated that the king preferred the company of hardened soldiers and ex-peasants to lords and ladies. He spent time in the training yard, sparring with men half his age. He personally oversaw the blacksmiths forging new arms for the city guard. When lords complained of taxes, he told them to count themselves lucky he didn't seize all their gold. He had never been taught the art of diplomacy, but what he lacked in finesse, he made up for in raw intimidation. The Faith, after years of friction with Cersei, approached the new king with caution. The High Septon ventured into the throne room, flanked by sparrows in threadbare robes, to speak of piety and the importance of uniting the realm under the guidance of the Seven. Sandor eyed him with cold amusement. He remembered how the Faith militant had cast judgment on those they deemed sinners, how they had paraded and humiliated women under the pretext of holiness. "There's a difference between protecting the innocent and lording over them," he told the High Septon bluntly. "You want to preach your Seven, do it in your September. If you harm the helpless in the name of your gods, I'll kill you myself." The High Septon, affronted, tried to protest that the Faith needed autonomy. The Hound's reply was a hard stare. "You've got your autonomy. Just remember who let you keep it." Despite the tension, the High Septon realized that the new king was not Joffrey or Cersei. At least he had no appetite for persecuting the devout. So they reached a fragile understanding. As the months passed, King's Landing slowly began to heal from the siege. Repairs were made to the walls, the gates, and the burned-out districts. Grain flowed in from the Reach and the Riverlands, ensuring that the city would not starve. The Hound appointed loyal men to key positions. The Master of War was a knight who had proven both valorous and just in earlier campaigns. The Master of Coin was a cunning steward who knew how to extract revenue without crushing the small folk entirely. The Master of Laws was a grizzled soldier who had no patience for corruption. In another era, the small council might have seemed laughably unrefined. But these men got results, and the city began to function with a practical, no-nonsense efficiency. Justice under King Sandor was swift and often brutal. Trials, when held, did not last long. He sat in judgment himself, usually in the morning. A blacksmith who had stolen from a neighbor might find himself losing a hand or being made to repay the victim tenfold if the circumstances warranted mercy. A lord who had harbored bandits to harass rival lands might find his castle seized. Some complained that the punishments were too harsh, but many recognized that after the chaos of the last war, a firm hand was needed. Peace was slowly returning to the streets. Even petty crime decreased when the rumor spread that the king personally oversaw floggings at dawn. Beyond the city, the lords of Westeros watched this new regime with wary curiosity. Some, like the new Warden of the North, depending on who claimed that title, sent delegations to negotiate trade and boundaries. Dorne tentatively opened a corridor for caravans. The Iron Islands, ever troublemakers, tested the waters by raiding along the coast of the Reach. The Hound responded by dispatching a fleet of refurbished royal ships, manned by dedicated soldiers, to patrol the sea and punish the raiders. He had no illusions that he could reform the Ironborn overnight, but he made it clear that if they escalated, he would bring fire and blood to their shores. Meanwhile, the Vale, ruled by Lord Robin Arryn or his regents, found it simpler to keep to themselves rather than poke at the dog on the Iron Throne. Gradually, the new order stabilized. The realm had seen so much war that few had the appetite for yet another. Sandor's authority, born of fear and battered respect, held. He found himself sitting the throne less and less, delegating tasks to men he trusted, prowling the corridors of the Red Keep, uneasy with the crown that now weighed upon him. He never officially had a coronation. He saw no point in such pomp. The small folk began referring to him as King Sandor or the King Hound. Some called him the Scourge King, referencing how he brought a scourge down upon bandits and corrupt lords alike. Children whispered stories of how the monstrous dog faced the undead mountain and won. Bards sang their ballads, no matter how much Sandor might sneer at them. Once in a while, he sat upon the balcony of Maegor's Holdfast, overlooking Blackwater Bay at sunset, the red sun glinting off the water. He remembered the last time he had seen the bay bathed in the green glow of wildfire. Now the city was quiet, the bay lapping at its shores like a contented hound. He wondered if this was truly what he had fought for. He had dethroned Cersei, avenged the wrongs inflicted on countless innocents, or so he told himself. But how many more had died in the process? How many more would die under his rule? He had never claimed to be a good man, only a better option than the devils who came before. Sometimes he thought of the Stark girls. If Sansa was out there, what would she think of the monstrous dog turned king? Would Arya appear at his gates one day, seeking vengeance, or would she join him in delivering justice to the realm's worst? He half hoped she would come, if only so he could see how far she had come from the fierce little girl with a sword. But he had heard no word, no rumor of her in some time. The North was a distant land, and for now they stayed out of his affairs. Cersei languished in a cell, bitter and haughty, refusing to plead for mercy. Sandor seldom thought of her, beyond the question of what to do next. Some demanded she be put to trial for regicide, for her role in the War of the Five Kings, for all the atrocities committed under Joffrey and Tommen. Others demanded a humiliating walk of atonement. The Hound cared little for spectacles. Perhaps he would put her to death quietly. Perhaps he would exile her. He had not decided, and part of him relished letting her stew in the darkness of a cell. Tyrion Lannister was nowhere to be found. Rumor placed him across the narrow sea, scheming or possibly dead. Jaime Lannister, too, was absent, rumored to have left King's Landing long before the siege. The Lannister lion was all but declawed, and the realm seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Yet peace was never certain. Rival powers lurked across the sea. The Iron Throne had changed hands so many times in recent years that the rest of the world scarcely believed it stable. Merchant ships approached King's Landing cautiously, uncertain if they would find an open port or the aftermath of a new coup. But, in time, they discovered that under King Sandor's rule, trade was tolerated, so long as taxes were paid and no contraband was smuggled. Some Essosi merchants even found it easier to deal with the straightforward demands of a soldier king than the labyrinthine corruption of past regimes. The moons turned, and the land saw the first real harvest post-war. Grain-filled storehouses, the city's market stalls teemed with fresh produce, and the small folk gradually let themselves hope. Many had grown up under constant fear, witnessing the War of the Five Kings, the arrival of foreign invaders, and all manner of chaos. Now, at least, the streets were safer, and the king's men patrolled with a fearsome diligence. People could go about their business without stumbling over dead bodies in the gutters each morning. They might still curse the new king's harsh edicts, but they had to admit that things were better than during the worst days of Lannister rule. Of course, some of the old nobility scoffed at the notion of a burned dog playing king. They whispered of conspiracies, dark rumors that the Hound consorted with witches or used black magic to defeat Sir Robert Strong. A few believed that it was only a matter of time before a true highborn claimant rose up to reclaim the throne. But those claimants never appeared, or if they did, they were swiftly crushed. The realm was tired, and the Hound was unstoppable with a sword. Gradually, even the most haughty lords came to court, knelt, and tried to curry favor. Sandor disdained them all, but he accepted their oaths. He made sure they left their gold as tribute before trudging back to their keeps. The question of succession nagged at certain courtiers. The king had no wife, no children. Who would rule after him? Some proposed he wed a noble lady from the Vale or the Reach to legitimize his line. Others suggested a political alliance with Dorne or the North. Sandor, for his part, found the suggestion laughable. "Why should I bother chaining myself to some highborn wench for an heir I don't want?" he growled. The lords persisted, but the Hound put off the matter. He refused to be drawn into the marriage game, at least for now. If the day came that he needed an heir, he'd cross that bloody bridge when he came to it. And so the Hound's kingship endured. It wasn't the golden era of a chivalrous monarch, nor was it the tyrannical rule of a mad queen. It was something else altogether, harsh but direct, brutal but strangely fair. Over time, the realm adapted. Banditry decreased, roads became safer. The small folk paid their taxes with grumbling resignation but no longer lived in terror of constant war. Some knights, remembering the illusions of chivalry, balked at the coarseness of the king's court. But others saw that the king enforced a code that, in its own grim way, was more honorable than many a highborn house's hypocrisy. Occasional rebellions flared, but they were put down quickly. The realm had endured too much strife to gather behind another pretender easily. The king's justice, administered by the blade when necessary, proved an effective deterrent. Foreign envoys from across the narrow sea arrived, seeking trade deals and alliances. Many were stunned to find that behind the savage exterior was a ruler who, while lacking formal education, possessed a soldier's practicality and a cunning mind. The Hound's motto was simple: don't lie, don't cheat, don't spill innocent blood. Do that, and you can leave with your head intact. It was an odd reflection of the vow knights were supposed to uphold but rarely did. In the Red Keep's courtyard, the Hound would sometimes train recruits personally. He drove them to exhaustion, cursing their slowness, their sloppy footwork. But he also taught them the lessons he had learned over a lifetime of combat. How to fight dirty if needed, how to exploit an enemy's fear. He told them to always remember that fancy armor and titles meant nothing when steel was at your throat. Many a fresh recruit learned to respect him, though he remained as gruff and unapproachable as ever. Yet for all the stability his reign brought, a sense of unease always lingered. The Hound sat upon a throne of swords, a seat forged by the conquest of Aegon Targaryen centuries past. He was a man who loathed the hypocrisy of knights and lords, yet now he had become their supreme authority. Some wondered if the realm's peace would last beyond his lifetime, or if his rule was merely another short chapter in Westeros's bloody history. Sandor himself held no illusions. He knew power was fleeting. On some nights, he would awake sweating from dreams of flames consuming the city, the same nightmares he'd had since childhood. He wondered if he could ever truly conquer that fear. Nevertheless, he had claimed the Iron Throne by force, and for the moment that force held. The Black Hound's head on banners flew over the Red Keep, over the gates, over the walls. Merchants came and went under the watchful eyes of stern black-cloaked guards. The small folk carried on, uncertain if they were living in a better age or just another passing tyranny. But at least for now, the common man could walk the streets without constant dread of being trampled by a noble's horse or cut down by a lawless brigand. For some, that was enough. And so Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the burned dog once sworn to House Lannister, became the unlikely ruler of Westeros. Those who had known him in his younger years would hardly believe it. But there he was, presiding over a throne that had broken mightier men than he. Perhaps the realm had merely traded one monster for another, or perhaps, against all odds, the realm had found a king who understood what it meant to live in fear and vowed that no one else need suffer it as he had. Time would tell, for in the Seven Kingdoms, peace was as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. And yet, for a while, the light burned brightly enough to illuminate a land that had seen too much darkness. Under the reign of the Hound, men of power no longer hid behind false chivalry, and those who preyed on the weak found themselves facing the iron jaws of the king who took his throne with blood and steel, and dared anyone to try to take it from him. Under the reign of Sandor Clegane, time passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. The Seven Kingdoms had never seen a king like him, low-born in their eyes, or at least not high-born enough to merit a crown. And yet there he sat, on a throne of twisted steel, one that Targaryens, Baratheons, and Lannisters had fought and bled to hold. Many questioned whether he would last a month, let alone a year. But the months turned regardless, and as they did, the scars of previous wars began to scab over, if not truly heal. The Hound's rule was harsh, often merciless, but it provided a stability the realm had not known in years of constant upheaval. His black-haired, rugged second-in-command, Ser Brenner of the Cold March, became a fixture at court. Brenner handled a great many matters the king could not be bothered with. Petitions from farmers, bickering between middling lords, even negotiations with tradesmen. Brenner was no master diplomat himself, but he had a calmer head than Sandor, a knack for finding workable compromises to keep the city and the realm from erupting in smaller fires. On more than one occasion, the king would stand in the middle of the throne room, glowering down at some cowering merchant or minor noble, only for Brenner to step in, voice measured, and propose a resolution that let the king's authority remain unchallenged without spilling fresh blood on the marble floors. It helped that Sandor allowed little corruption within his immediate sphere of power. Where King Joffrey had been indulged by sycophants, and where Queen Cersei had cultivated a web of informants and backstabbing loyalists, Sandor had no tolerance for flattery or hidden agendas. If a man or woman wanted something from him, they had best speak plainly. If he caught them lying outright, they might not survive the hour. An ugly rumor spread that the king fed traitors to starving dogs in the Red Keep's kennels, though in truth he had not gone so far yet. Most found it believable enough to keep their dealings straightforward. The king's blunt, often coarse style trickled through all levels of governance. The new City Watch, known colloquially as the Black Dogs, wore dark cloaks and carried short swords engraved with the faint shape of a hound's head. Their oath was simple: protect the people who follow the law, punish those who do not. Thieves and murderers no longer found safe corners in Flea Bottom as they had in years past. The Black Dogs were as pitiless as their ruler. Yet, unlike the old gold cloaks, they did not casually harass the innocent or extort coin at every turn. When a guard was caught abusing his office, the king wasted no time in making an example. Those examples sometimes ended in the traitor's head spiked at the city gates, a grim reminder that the top dog in King's Landing cared little for the customary leniency once afforded to uniformed brutes. Even so, the city was far from idyllic. Beggars still lined the streets in some districts. Flea Bottom still reeked of filth. Sandor had no illusions that he could turn King's Landing into a paradise overnight. His main concern was ensuring that the horrors of war, looting, rape, random murder, did not befall his subjects again, whether at the hands of marauders or the crown's own forces. He knew many of the small folk disliked him, but they learned quickly that if they kept peace and paid their taxes, the king's men would leave them be. It was a low bar to clear, yet to many it already seemed an improvement over the days when the Lannisters or other pretenders demanded crippling tribute, inflicted cruelty for sport, or starved the city under siege. Outside the city walls, in the Crownlands and the Riverlands, the Hound's rule took the shape of whichever local lord he installed or confirmed in power. Some were men who had proven their loyalty on the battlefield, men from low houses or even commoners knighted for valor. Others were older lords who had bent the knee and shown they could follow the king's commandments. Sandor had little taste for intricately carved lineages, but he understood that some ties to tradition kept the realm from splitting at the seams. He let many a lord retain his seat, provided that lord abided by the new code of governance. No unlawful torture, no rampant extortion, no oppression of small folk that might incite rebellion. More than once, a dispatch arrived at the Red Keep reporting that a certain lord's men had flayed peasants, or that a certain lady had tortured a servant girl for petty theft. The Hound's response was always swift. A squad of black dogs would ride out, investigate, and if the accusations were true, the offenders were dragged back to King's Landing in chains, or carried back in pieces. Such uncompromising methods cultivated a strange brand of respect from lesser folk. Tales spread that the king did not care if you were lowborn or highborn. Break his law and you would pay. In some villages, children ran about in improvised hound helms, chanting half-silly rhymes about the dog king who'd burned the city's scum. Villagers who had once been exploited by lords found cautious hope that, for the moment at least, they had recourse if wronged. But hope and fear often rode side by side. They knew the king's men were not gentle, and they had heard the king's own rages could be terrifying. Beyond the Crownlands, the rest of Westeros watched from a distance, adjusting to this new equilibrium. The Vale stayed behind its mountains, governed by Lord Robin Arryn and his regents. Their attitude toward King Sandor was one of polite distance. They neither recognized him with grand ceremonies nor openly opposed him. For now, they simply avoided entanglement, continuing to hoard their resources until they could see if the realm stabilized. In the Reach, House Tyrell remained uncertain. Mace Tyrell had died not long after the events of the Great War, leaving the reins to his heirs, though the family's real power was often guided by the formidable Lady Olenna before her own passing. The new generation of Tyr. Els considered whether forging a trade alliance or marriage tie with the king in King's Landing might grant them favor. Their harvests were bountiful, and it was an open secret that King Sandor needed the reaches produced to feed the populace. So a quiet and uneasy alliance formed. The Tyrells offered grain shipments at fair prices, and the Hound's regime ensured their safe passage. Everyone understood the arrangement was pragmatic, not cordial. One day it might shift if the Tyrells saw a chance to reclaim the capital for themselves or to install someone else. But for now, there was little appetite for another war. The Westerlands were subdued, though not entirely docile. Many lesser Lannisters had been killed, captured, or driven into hiding. A handful of defiant bannermen continued to foment trouble along the borders, occasionally raiding shipments bound for King's Landing. In response, Sandor had posted loyal men in some of the old Lannister keeps, ensuring a watchful presence. By and large, the region accepted that the Iron Throne was beyond their grasp for the foreseeable future. The name Lannister no longer carried the same dread it once had. The king in the capital was no lion but a hound with a sharper bite than many had expected. The North remained a wild card. The Boltons had been largely toppled in the chaos of the previous wars, but House Stark's line was uncertain. Some believed that Sansa Stark ruled in Winterfell under a shaky coalition, or that Arya Stark might be hidden somewhere in the vast tundra, or that Jon Snow, the bastard who had become king in the north for a spell, had vanished beyond the wall. Rumors swirled, few confirmed. There were suggestions that the North might not even care who sat the Iron Throne, so long as they were left to govern themselves. For the moment, Sandor left them alone, seeing no profit in another campaign so far from the heart of the realm. It was enough to keep King's Landing stable without marching an army up the King's Road to freeze in the snows. Dorne, ever independent, sniffed at the idea of a Dog King on the Iron Throne. They had not forgotten the atrocities committed by the Mountain in the past, or that the Hound had served House Lannister. And yet the Hound's victory over Ser Robert Strong, believed by many to be Gregor's reanimated corpse, won him a measure of reluctant respect in Sunspear. Some said that in killing the monster, Sandor avenged Elia Martell in a roundabout way, and for that, the Dornish might consider him less repugnant than they did the Lannisters. Dorne was never one to bend easily, but for now, they traded with the crown and did not challenge its authority too openly. Amid this tenuous peace, King Sandor found his greatest battles were not with steel on a battlefield, but with the day-to-day responsibilities that came with ruling. He had little patience for squabbling courtiers, and yet those squabbles threatened to tear apart the fragile alliances he needed to maintain. Ser Brenner frequently reminded him that though the king might settle many issues with a glare and a threat, good governance also required a bit of nuance. One day, a problem arose that tested exactly how far the Hound would go for the sake of order. A dispute in the Reach turned violent. House Oakenshield, a lesser branch sworn to the Tyrells, had been accused of extorting travelers along the Rose Road, beating and robbing them under the guise of collecting royal taxes. When the Tyrells demanded they stop, Lord Oakenshield refused, claiming that the new king in King's Landing had granted him authority. This was a lie, obviously, but it spread confusion. Merchants began refusing to travel, halting crucial food shipments. Lady Alice Tyrell sent a raven to King's Landing, demanding clarity and retribution. Did the king truly condone House Oakenshield's actions, or would he bring them to heel? Sandor, upon reading the raven, let out a string of curses that echoed across the throne room. "Bloody parasites, every last one," he growled. He summoned Ser Brenner and a small retinue. "We ride for the Reach," he announced. "I'll deal with this Oakenshield myself." Despite warnings that it might be unwise for a king to march personally over such a seemingly trivial matter, Sandor insisted. He would not have his name used as an excuse to prey on common folk. That was the entire reason he had toppled the Lannisters. Besides, he had grown claustrophobic in the Red Keep. A part of him longed for the open road, for a chance to remind himself he was not just a man sitting in a gilded cage. And so, the king rode out with 200 of his best. Among them were seasoned knights who had fought at his side during the siege of King's Landing, archers who had proven their worth in the Riverlands, and a handful of old friends from the earlier campaigns. Gruff men who had once been sellswords or wanderers and now found themselves in the king's retinue. The Hound wore his familiar battered armor, though it was reinforced and blackened to a high polish. His snarling dog's head helm was still unmistakable, though some said the goldsmiths had inlaid a subtle crown motif around the brow. Sandor scowled at that addition but hadn't bothered to remove it. Their journey down the Rose Road took days. Along the way, they passed farmland that had mostly recovered from the devastation of war. Fields of barley and wheat waved in the sun. They also passed wagons stalled or turned around, their merchants explaining that they dared not go farther for fear of being robbed by Oakenshield's men. Sandor's rage simmered. When at last they reached the lands in question, a modest estate with a stone tower keep and a scattering of villages, they found the peasants downtrodden, forced to pay tolls they could ill afford. Many recognized the Hound by sight or by rumor, and they stared in confusion, uncertain whether this new king would make matters worse or better. At the gates of the Oakenshield keep, a cluster of armed men stood guard. Their leader, a stocky knight with a bushy mustache, tried to bar the king's entry. When Sandor demanded to speak with Lord Oakenshield, the man sneered. "His lordship said no visitors unless they bear gold," he said, gaze lingering mockingly on Sandor's scarred face. "And you've brought only steel by the looks of it." Sandor answered with a heavy gauntlet fist to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. The other guards hesitated, glancing at one another. A few drew swords, but Sandor's mounted knights outnumbered them 3-1, and a line of archers had arrows nocked. The standoff was brief. "Open the damn gate," the king growled. Moments later, inside the courtyard, they found Lord Oakenshield perched on a dais in front of his main hall. A portly man with greased hair and a ridiculous cape embroidered with small wooden shields. He tried to appear regal, but the effect was undone by his obvious nervousness at the sight of a black-helmed king. By the time Sandor dismounted, Oakenshield's voice shook. "Your Grace, to what do I owe the honor? Surely you could have sent a raven if you had questions about our collection of taxes." "Shut your mouth," Sandor said, voice reverberating in the enclosed space. He strode forward, slamming the hound helm under his arm so Oakenshield could see the livid scar on his face, the fury in his eyes. "You dare claim my name to justify your banditry? You dare turn away honest trade meant for King's Landing?" He flicked his gaze to the cowering courtiers in Oakenshield's retinue. Who here helped him in this scheme? A dozen men and women froze, terrified. Lord Oakenshield tried to sputter excuses. "My lord, I mean, your grace, we merely sought to collect a fair share for the crown. Times are tight, you see, and we must ensure that." "Don't lie to me," Sandor snapped. "You've been shaking down travelers for your own pockets. It's a wonder you haven't extorted half the reach by now." He turned to his knights. "Strip these fools of their weapons and lock them in their own cells. Anyone who resists, kill them." Oakenshield's men glanced around, clearly outmatched. Some dropped their swords immediately. Others hesitated but saw no point in a doomed stand. Within minutes, the retinue was disarmed. Oakenshield himself was seized by two of the king's knights, who pinned his arms behind his back. He whined for mercy, promising gold, land, anything. Sandor ignored him and stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Oakenshield and a few onlookers heard. "You've cost the crown more than you can pay with coin," he said. "You've cost your small folk their safety on the roads, cost the Tyrells their trade deals, and cost me my time." The king's eyes glinted with cold fury. "There's a price for that." Oakenshield's pleas became a frantic babble, citing family ties, rights of nobility, everything he could think of. It was all worthless. That same evening, Sandor convened a hasty hearing in Oakenshield's own great hall. Witnesses, merchants, farmers, peasants, were brought in to describe the tolls, the beatings, the theft. The next morning, with no fanfare, Sandor pronounced judgment. Oakenshield would hang. A hush fell over the courtyard where it was carried out. The man's assembled family wailed, and some demanded a trial by combat, claiming that was their right under the old laws. Sandor allowed it. He stepped forward himself. "No champion can save you from this," he told Oakenshield. But the terrified lord's nephew, a taller, lean man, insisted on fighting for his uncle's honor. A circle formed in the courtyard. The nephew donned a half set of plate, trembling yet trying to appear brave, while King Sandor took up a worn-practice sword from a rack near the training yard. Someone offered to fetch the king's better weapon, but Sandor waved them off. The nephew lunged, fighting with the desperation of a man whose entire family name was on the line. But it was evident he had only ever fought in tourneys, or perhaps against poorly armed brigands. Sandor sidestepped his first strike, battered aside the second, and hammered the youth's sword arm with a punishing blow. The nephew's blade clattered to the cobblestones. With a second vicious swing, Sandor struck him across the temple, sending him to the ground unconscious. He spat in the dust. "That's the trial," he growled. Oakenshield, sobbing, was dragged to the scaffold and hanged. The man's face turned red, then purple, then he was gone. Sandor ordered the body cut down and unceremoniously buried. The rest of the Oakenshield family, if they had not directly abetted his crimes, were spared for the moment but stripped of their lands. He appointed a new castellan, a minor knight from his retinue who had proven trustworthy, to govern the keep until Lady Alice Tyrell could propose a legitimate replacement. The uncle's nephew survived, but with a cracked skull that left him delirious. Whether that was mercy or cruelty, none could say. Soon after, King Sandor rode on, leaving behind a small force to enforce the new order. The roads near Oakenshield's domain reopened. Merchants ventured forth again, warily. Many found it grimly reassuring that the king had personally come to punish those who misused his name. Word of his swift justice spread across the reach, earning him a blend of awe and fear. Lady Alice Tyrell sent a message expressing relief and gratitude, though the note also contained a subtle hint that the Tyrells could handle such matters themselves in the future. Sandor's reply, read by Ser Brenner, was as direct as ever. If the Tyrells could not control their own vassals, the king would do it for them, and next time, he might not stop at hanging a single lord. Returning to King's Landing, Sandor found the city much as he'd left it. Hectic, foul-smelling, and congested, but functioning under the new order. A group of craftsmen had petitioned the castle for funds to rebuild parts of Flea Bottom that had collapsed in a recent storm. Another group of merchants insisted that taxes on imported olive oil were too high. The High Septon, anxious to reassert the faith's influence, waited in the throne room, requesting an audience to discuss the revival of certain sept educations. Sandor, weary from the road, listened to all of this with a blank stare. He gave brief answers, funding a measure of repairs so the city wouldn't literally crumble, refusing to lower the taxes, telling the High Septon that he didn't care if the Sept opened new schools so long as they didn't incite unrest or try to undermine the crown. Days blurred into weeks. The king's life was an endless cycle of seatings in the throne room, martial drills in the courtyard, and tense council meetings with Ser Brenner and the newly formed small council. The men who served on that council were not the typical highborn lords but, by necessity, individuals who understood the Hound's mindset. Some had once been peasants or soldiers elevated to positions of authority. Others were lesser lords with battered reputations who had proven their loyalty. Under normal circumstances, they might have been laughed out of any court in Westeros. But now no one was laughing, none dared. Each one had earned a place through steel or cunning, and each recognized that the king's wrath was a constant threat if they succumbed to petty ambitions. One persistent question, increasingly whispered among the highest circles and the commoners alike, was the matter of succession. The Hound, for all his fearsome prowess, was mortal. Who would wear the crown after him? Many among the nobility believed that at least establishing a line of inheritance, or marrying some lady to beget an heir, would calm the realm and secure alliances. Some tried to persuade the king himself. Others tried to approach Ser Brenner or any rumored favorite to float the idea. But Sandor was as implacable as ever. He rebuffed every suggestion of marriage, ignoring even the rumor that a handful of highborn ladies were quietly making themselves available to him. A few bolder lords proposed he look for a bride among the Tyrells or the Martells, forging a real tie that might keep the realm united. Sandor would only grunt something about not needing a wife, sniffing around his seat of power. One night, after a long day of hearings, Sandor found himself alone in the council chambers with a jug of sour red wine. The others had gone, leaving him to brood. He hated the feeling that came over him, this sense that something was always missing. He'd sat upon the Iron Throne for more than a year now, and though the realm was steadier than it had been in ages, it offered him no peace. The crown weighed heavily, albeit one he seldom wore outside of formal ceremonies. The responsibilities of kingship pulled him further from the memory of the man who had once roamed the Riverlands, a lone dog searching for scraps of redemption. In the quiet, his mind drifted to the Stark girls again. He wondered where Sansa was. Did she live in Winterfell, or was she somewhere across the narrow sea? And Arya. The little wolf had haunted him, challenging him at every turn, refusing to be cowed. He remembered the stubborn fire in her eyes. She would have hated courtly life just as much as he did, perhaps more. He supposed it was just as well that neither was here to see him perched on the throne like a battered sentinel, carved from stone and old wounds. It would only confuse things, or worse, remind him too clearly of the man he used to be. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Ser Brenner entered, face lined with concern. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I bring news from the west. Your men near Casterly Rock send word that remnants of Lannister loyalists are gathering. They found a leader, a young woman calling herself Myrcella Lannister." Sandor set his wine down with a clunk. "Myrcella?" he echoed, voice low. I heard she was in Dorne. Some said she was dead. Others said they'd crowned her queen during the War of the Five Kings, or tried to. She's still alive. Brenner nodded. Apparently so. She's come to the Rock under the pretense of restoring the rightful Lannister line to the Iron Throne. Our reports say she's accompanied by a few knights from the Westerlands, and possibly aided by some Dornish retinue that followed her out of loyalty to Prince Doran's old treaties. No large army yet, but the region remains unstable enough that she's gathering support. Sandor was silent for a moment. Myrcella had never been like Joffrey. She'd been a sweet, polite girl, if he remembered rightly. Tommen had been mild too, more so than any of Cersei's brood. But the Lannister name would always conjure ghosts and illusions of power. If she truly intended to press her claim as the rightful queen, that would mean new conflict. Sandor felt a grim wave of inevitability. He had toppled Cersei, but if Myrcella emerged as a standard-bearer for Lannister loyalists, the realm could slide back into chaos. And ironically, Myrcella might even draw some sympathy. She had never been personally cruel like Joffrey, and she was rumored to have the favor of some Dornish houses. The mention of her name might inspire those who believed in some sense of legitimacy to rally. He looked at Brenner. How many men does she have? Hard to say, Brenner replied. A few hundred at most, spread across smaller keeps. Some old bannermen of the Lannisters might flock to her if she proves she's serious. Others might prefer to wait and see who wins. Again. Sandor rubbed the bridge of his nose, scarred flesh under his fingertips. Send a message to our men at Casterly Rock. Tell them to keep a close watch. If Myrcella wants to parley, we'll hear her out. If she tries to seize power by force, we'll crush her. I've had enough of Lannister games. Brenner hesitated. What if Myrcella claims to be queen by right and demands you step aside? A cold grin touched Sandor's lips. Then let her try. She'll find the Iron Throne not so easy to take. He paused, thinking of the innocent little girl he'd occasionally seen in King's Landing. That was a long time ago. This Myrcella was older now, perhaps hardened by Dorne's intrigues and the tragedies of her family. The child who once roamed the Red Keep's corridors in quiet grace might now be something else entirely. I'd rather not kill her, he muttered almost to himself. But I'll do what needs doing if she starts a damned war. News of Myrcella's appearance in the Westerlands trickled through the court. Some dismissed it as a minor threat. Others saw the potential for a serious uprising if Myrcella courted the right lords or made an alliance with the Tyrells or the Martells. For her part, Cersei, still languishing in a cell beneath the Red Keep, learned of it through a whispered rumor from a sympathetic jailer. She raved to see her daughter, demanded that the king allow her to speak with Myrcella or at least correspond by Raven. When the king heard this, he refused. The idea of letting that bitter woman meddle from her cell was laughable. And so Cersei fumed in darkness, left to wonder if her daughter might avenge her. As the tension simmered, Sandor's thoughts returned to the question of whether the realm was truly free of the old scum. He had dethroned one Lannister queen, but the line was still alive, like a weed that refused to die. He confided in Brenner that perhaps he should ride out west again, crush any potential rebellion before it blossomed. But Brenner cautioned patience. If the king marched a large army into the Westerlands, that might only rally more supporters to Myrcella, painting the Hound as a tyrant. Far better, Brenner reasoned, to wait and see how many lords truly flocked to her. If Myrcella's movement remained small, a few strategic maneuvers could cut out the heart of the threat without igniting another civil war. For a while, Sandor took that advice, albeit grudgingly. He returned to the daily grind of rulership, overseeing the city's defenses, stamping out corruption in the Crownlands, and receiving cautious messengers from the other regions. All the while, he waited for fresh news from the Westerlands. Ravens arrived periodically, each with updates on Myrcella's progress. She had gained the support of a few minor lords whose holdings lay near Lannisport. There were rumors that even some knights of House Rain, distant cousins or remnants who once survived Tywin Lannister's wrath, were quietly aiding her, seeing a chance to restore their ancient feud with the Iron Throne under new terms. Most troubling was the suggestion that a contingent of Dornish knights had indeed accompanied Myrcella, led by one Ser Tristain Martel, rumored to be her betrothed. Their numbers were not large, but the Martel name carried weight, and if Dorne formally supported Myrcella, it could mean a realm-wide conflict. Days stretched into weeks without a decisive development, until one morning Ser Brenner entered the throne room, face grim. "A raven, your grace," he said, handing over a scroll. "You'll want to read it." Sandor's scowl deepened as he scanned the parchment. It was a message from Myrcella herself, penned in a neat, flowing hand. She addressed him as Lord Clegane, omitting any reference to kingship. She declared that she had come of age and had a rightful claim to the throne as the eldest living child of King Robert Baratheon and Queen Cersei Lannister. She asked him to step aside peacefully and cede the crown to her, promising that he would be commended for his service in liberating the realm from my mother's misguided regency. She pledged mercy for his men and pardons for many, but made it clear that if he refused, bloodshed would follow. The letter was formal, even polite, yet it boiled Sandor's blood more than if she had flung direct insults. "So," he growled, tossing the parchment aside, "the little girl with golden curls thinks she can unseat me with pretty words." He massaged the scar tissue on his face, a habit when he was agitated. "What do you think, Brenner? Should I write back and tell her to shove her quill up her arse?" Brenner's expression was cautious. "It might be wise to respond. She's not Joffrey. She's known to have a gentle reputation, and it could sway the small folk if she paints you as a usurper. We should remind the realm what your reign has accomplished: peace, order, justice, and that Myrcella's family was removed for a reason." Sandor gave a harsh laugh. "She's Joffrey's sister. The realm hasn't forgotten what that lot did." Still, he saw the sense in Brenner's advice. Myrcella was playing a game of optics. If she could position herself as a merciful alternative, especially to the many who feared the Hound's brutality, she might undermine him. "I'll write her a reply," he said grudgingly. "Or you will for me. Keep it brief and blunt. Tell her that I'm not budging from the throne, that the realm needs no child's illusions of birthright. If she crosses the border of the Crownlands in force, I'll meet her there and put her loyalists to the sword." His lips twisted. "And if she wants a parley, I'll hear it, but I'll pick the time and place." Brenner nodded, preparing to draft the letter. Yet, behind his calm facade, he shared the king's concern. War seemed inevitable unless Myrcella's supporters splintered from within. As they awaited her response, the tension around court thickened. Lords who secretly doubted Sandor's legitimacy began to watch the wind, pondering a switch of allegiance if Myrcella looked likely to prevail. Merchants, worried about trade, began hoarding resources or raising prices, anticipating conflict. The realm once again felt the tremors of oncoming strife. Cersei, in her cell, learned of this exchange when she bribed a guard with a promise of future reward. She was exultant to hear Myrcella had formally laid claim. "My daughter will not fail," she rasped through the bars. "She has the blood of lions and kings in her veins, more royal than that dog could ever dream." In the darkness, she cackled, imagining the downfall of the monster who had once served as Joffrey's bodyguard. How sweet it would be to see him dragged off that throne and cast into the black cells himself. Meanwhile, a more surprising element entered the fray: Dorne. For years, Dorne had played its own game of subtle alliances, first with the Targaryens of old, then with House Baratheon, then tangentially with the Lannisters through Myrcella's betrothal to Tristain Martell. After the chaos of the previous wars, many Dornish lords had withdrawn, nursing their grievances in private. But now, with a potential Queen Myrcella, a portion of the Dornish nobility saw a chance to place on the throne someone who was half Baratheon and half Lannister, yet bound by marriage to Martell, a queen who might owe them a great debt of gratitude. If that meant pushing out the dog who had usurped the seat by violence, so be it. Not all of Dorne felt this way, but a strong faction did. The Prince of Dorne, an ailing man rumored to be unwell in body and mind, said little in official capacity. The region was effectively led by a council of powerful houses. Some in that council favored neutrality, but the more hawkish among them saw an opportunity to become the power behind the throne if Myrcella succeeded. None of this was lost on the king in King's Landing. He summoned the small council in the Red Keep's tapestry-hung chamber. Stale air weighed on them as he paced at the head of the table, scowling. "So Myrcella's not alone. She's got some Dornish at her back," Sandor said, voice echoing. "I want a head count. I want to know how many men, how many swords. I want to know if any of those prancing lords in the Reach plan to join her." One of his counselors, a stocky ex-merchant named Lorik, cleared his throat. "Our spies suggest some Dornish houses are sending small contingents, but not enough for a direct invasion. They might intend to land in the Westerlands or move along the Dornish marches to link up with Myrcella's forces. As for the Reach, Lady Alice Tyrell has sent no indication she'd support Myrcella. She's too dependent on your patronage, your grace, and has no love for House Lannister after their mutual betrayals." Sandor nodded curtly, though that offered only mild reassurance. "We'll keep men on the Rose Road, and double the watch on the coasts near Dorne." He slammed a fist on the table. "Damn these Lannisters and their spawn. I should have seen this coming the moment I left her breathing in Dorne." Ser Brenner exchanged a look with Lorik. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "we might consider a diplomatic solution if she only has a few hundred men. Myrcella might be open to—" Sandor cut him off with a glare. "She's made her claim. I'm not stepping aside, nor do I plan on sharing the throne. If she wants to avoid bloodshed, she can go back to Dorne, live out her days in one of their palaces, and stop calling herself queen." The council fell silent. They knew better than to press the issue. Still, the tension was palpable. If Myrcella raised a banner of rebellion, was Sandor truly prepared to slaughter her in battle? She was, after all, a girl who had never been known for cruelty, someone many in the realm might rally to if they preferred a gentler ruler than the Hound. But no one dared voice these concerns too openly. Over the coming weeks, more disturbing reports arrived. Myrcella's forces were growing, albeit slowly. A few knights in the Westerlands, men who had once sworn fealty to Cersei or Tywin, came forward to pledge loyalty to Myrcella. They were not numerous, but enough to give her a respectable cavalry. Then came rumors that a ship or two bearing the Martell Sun and Spear sigil had docked at Lannisport. If that was true, the Dornish involvement might be more serious than initially believed. News also emerged that Myrcella had issued public statements of intent, promising lower taxes, friendlier trade policies, and a return to proper Westerosi tradition. She vowed not to rule with fear but with justice and compassion. A portion of her declaration read, "My mother's regency was marred by cruelty. I stand here to remind the realm that not all Lannisters follow that path. I offer a hand of peace to any who would see the realm governed by fairness, not by the lash." Many small folk, especially in places where the Hound's men had punished crimes harshly, took notice. Some believed Myrcella's words were naive or empty. Others saw in them a glimmer of hope. At the Red Keep, Sandor's face darkened whenever these declarations were read aloud. On one hand, he hated hypocrisy. On the other, he wondered if the girl might actually believe her own ideals. That made it more dangerous if she were truly sincere, because sincerity could be quite persuasive. He could not simply denounce her as a monster like Joffrey or a schemer like Cersei. The realm might see her as a victim or a rightful princess reclaimed. He needed another angle, or he needed to end her threat decisively. Part of him itched to mount his horse, gather an overwhelming host, and storm the Westerlands. But Brenner and the other counselors urged restraint. Better to let Myrcella show her hand, to see if she marched first. To complicate matters, ravens arrived from the north. The new warden of the north, some bannerman of House Stark, if the rumors were true, expressed grave concern about a resurgence of whites beyond the wall. Several watchers in the Night's Watch had vanished, and disturbing signs pointed to renewed undead activity. Though many in the south had dismissed the stories of the White Walkers after the War of the Five Kings, the north insisted the threat might not be fully vanquished. They requested men, resources, or at least recognition of the danger. Sandor, who had never seen the White Walkers himself, was skeptical, but he recalled the tales from men who fought at the Wall. Could that threat truly return? If so, How was he to handle it when Marcella was stirring up trouble in the west? The king ended up sending a terse reply: "Hold them off. The crown cannot spare men for ghost stories. If it's real, the North must guard the realm. That is your charge." It was not the courtesy-laden response the North might have hoped for, but the Hound saw no use in dividing his forces based on unverified rumors. He already faced too many potential fires at once. As the summer wore on, Marcella's challenge grew more brazen. She declared herself Marcella of the houses Baratheon and Lannister, first of her name, and began styling her letters with the royal "we." A few minor skirmishes flared in the Westerlands between her supporters and local garrisons loyal to the Hound's regime. At first, these were small, inconclusive. Neither side wanted to fully commit without more information. But each clash fed the rumor mill, suggesting that war was all but inevitable. The final straw came when Marcella began courting the Ironborn. The Iron Islands, ever eager for plunder and chaos, received an envoy from Marcella offering them opportunities to raid those loyal to the usurper dog should they support her cause. While there was no immediate evidence the Ironborn would join her, even the possibility was enough to make the crown uneasy. The last thing Sandor needed was Ironborn marauders sacking coastal towns in the Reach or the Riverlands. Sandor called a war council in the Red Keep. It was a hot afternoon, the air stagnant. Tension crackled like a storm about to break. The king stood at the head of a long table, maps of Westeros spread out before him. Around him gathered his most trusted knights, key counselors, and a few local lords who had proven their loyalty. They studied the map where pins and markers represented Marcella's known or suspected forces. "She's holed up near Lannisport," said Ser Brenner, tapping the map. "We have loyal garrisons at Casterly Rock and Case, but they're not large enough to crush her. If we move our main army west, we risk leaving King's Landing vulnerable, unless we secure a large enough force to protect the city." "She'll continue to gather strength if we wait," said Ser Rutger, a knight who had served Sandor since the early days. "Better to go now, strike hard, and end this before she grows too powerful." Sandor's brow furrowed. "A siege of Lannisport or a pitched battle near it won't be easy. We have the men, yes, but traveling across the Crownlands and the Riverlands takes time. Meanwhile, she might slip away or coordinate with the Dornish for a pincer move. If the Ironborn join her, we'll have raids along the coast too." A younger knight, newly appointed to the small council, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, perhaps we can recall part of the army from the Riverlands to bolster the west, leaving a smaller garrison here in King's Landing. The city is fairly secure, and any rebels within the Crownlands would be outnumbered by your established forces." Sandor drummed his fingers on the table. He hated the logistical complexities. "We could do that," he allowed. "But if we strip too many men from the Riverlands, we risk fresh banditry or another idiot lord deciding now's the time to rebel." He looked at the map again, remembering how the War of the Five Kings had fragmented the realm. The last thing he wanted was to repeat that chaos. "We'll have to be clever about this." Brenner leaned forward, voice calm. "What if we send an advance force, led by a capable commander, to fortify Casterly Rock and begin skirmishing with Marcella's supporters, while we remain in King's Landing with the bulk of the army? That would force her to either come out and fight before she's ready or hunker down. Meanwhile, we can prepare a second wave if necessary." Sandor considered. "Who leads the advance force?" "I would volunteer," said Brenner, though he glanced at Sandor apprehensively. "Unless your Grace wishes to lead in person." Sandor exhaled, scanning the faces around the table. "If I ride out personally, I risk leaving a power vacuum here. I know that. But if I don't go, the men might think I'm hiding behind the Red Keep." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Can't have them thinking the king is too scared to face a girl." No one laughed. They all knew that Marcella, though female and young, was not to be dismissed. The real challenge was her claim and her supporters, not her personal skill with a blade. Still, morale mattered. The Hound's men were used to following him on the battlefield, seeing his fearless example. If he remained in the city, some might question his resolve. In the end, they decided on a compromise. A portion of the king's forces, some 5,000 men, would march under the command of Cerbrenner toward the Westerlands, reinforcing Casterly Rock and preparing for a possible siege or field battle. Meanwhile, the king would raise an additional force from the Crownlands and Riverlands, training and drilling new recruits for a second wave. Once that force was ready, he would march west himself if Myrcella's threat had not dissipated. This plan, while not perfect, allowed for caution without surrendering the initiative. The next few weeks saw an intense flurry of activity. Blacksmiths in King's Landing worked day and night forging new weapons and armor for the recruits. Houses sworn to the crown in the Riverlands were ordered to send levies. The roads clogged with supply wagons, mercenaries looking for contracts, and peasants dragged into service. There was an air of grim anticipation throughout the city. Again, the common folk muttered, would they never see true peace? As Cerbrenner prepared to depart, Sandor met with him in a quiet courtyard of the Red Keep, away from prying eyes. The king wore a simple leather jerkin, his sword belted at his waist, hair sweaty from the midday heat. Brenner bowed, though Sandor waved the gesture off. You've always served me well, said the Hound, voice low. You were there when I took the city. I trust you more than any of those fancy pricks in the throne room. Don't fail me now. Brenner nodded, stoic. I'll do what must be done, your grace. Myrcella's presence is a spark. I'll see that it doesn't become a wildfire. Sandor's scarred features hardened. If you capture her, you bring her back alive. I don't want her slipping away to become some martyred figure in the realm. But if she resists, well, you know what to do. Brenner swallowed. Understood. They clasped arms. Then Brenner turned and walked away, off to marshal his host in the castle yard. Sandor watched him go, wondering if he had just sent his right hand into a den of lions, literally and figuratively. The tension in his gut warned him that, no matter how careful they were, the realm stood on the precipice of another bloodbath. Cerbrenner's departure sparked a new wave of rumors. The streets of King's Landing buzzed with speculation. Was the king truly planning to face Myrcella in person soon? Which side would the Reach ultimately take? Would Dorne intervene more aggressively? Would the Ironborn emerge from the sea like wolves on the fold? Everyone had a theory, and none had a firm answer. Myrcella herself seemed to sense the shift. She dispatched another raven to King's Landing, this time more pointed in tone, criticizing the king's unwillingness to meet with me and accusing him of ignoring rightful negotiation. She signed it simply, Myrcella, Queen by right of the Seven Kingdoms. This message circulated through the court, eliciting sneers from some and wary looks from others. Sandor had half a mind to ignore it, but after pondering, he wrote a single-sentence reply, If you want a parley, I'll grant one. Outside the gates of Casterly Rock, once I arrive with my men. Some took that as a sign the Hound might indeed march soon. Yet Sandor did not leave at once. He stayed in King's Landing, mustering new levies, ensuring the city would remain stable in his absence. Days stretched on. The late summer sun scorched the capital, filling the air with the odor of sweat and waste. The king rarely left the Red Keep except to inspect the training yards and the granaries. Reports from Cerbrenner trickled in. Myrcella's numbers were indeed growing. She had taken a small castle near Lannisport and was rumored to be fortifying it. Dornish riders moved along the coastline, possibly scouting or waiting for reinforcements. Brenner himself had skirmished with a group of Myrcella's outriders, capturing a few. They confessed that a handful of Westerland lords were ready to rise for her if she proved strong enough. As the gathered recruits in King's Landing formed into a semblance of an army, Sandor's impatience mounted. He wanted to be out there, swinging his sword, deciding matters in a single fierce engagement rather than drowning in the bureaucracy of his council. Every day in the throne room felt like a chore, especially with merchants demanding price controls, beggars seeking royal charity, and petty lords quarreling over boundaries. Still, he forced himself to remain until the men were properly drilled and the city's defenses thoroughly organized. Finally, in early autumn, word arrived that Myrcella had marched east from Lannisport, heading toward the hills near Casterly Rock. She was bringing with her a band of Dornish knights led by Trystane Martell, and rumor said she intended to challenge the crown's garrison directly. Ser Brenner sent an urgent raven. I can hold them off for a while, but if she's truly committed, we'll need your strength to break her. That was enough for the Hound. Within 2 days, he and his newly formed host, numbering close to 8,000, with a mix of cavalry, archers, and infantry, departed King's Landing. The king rode at the head in full armor, the black hound's head helm turned to the horizon. As they left, the city's gates clanged shut behind them, manned by a solid garrison under a loyal knight's command. Many small folk lined the roadside to watch the black banners pass, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. Some offered blessings, while others spat curses under their breath, fearing that the crown's departure could invite chaos in the streets. Sandor's army marched west, overshadowing villages as it passed. The route followed the Gold Road, which cut through rolling hills and farmland. The days were long, the nights filled with the sound of thousands of men rustling in their tents, cooking over makeshift fires. Sandor insisted on discipline, punishing any soldier caught pillaging local peasants. He wanted no resentments festering in these borderlands, no easy propaganda for Myrcella to use against him. Still, tensions simmered, for 8,000 men on the move always meant a strain on resources. Horses needed fodder, men needed bread and ale. The king paid for what he could, though some might have argued that forced purchases from local farmers were hardly better than theft. In war, lines blurred. Along the journey, Sandor's scouts brought him regular updates. Myrcella had indeed taken up a position in a low valley near Casterly Rock, where she had erected a modest camp. Reports placed her total strength at nearly 4,000, a mix of Westerland's knights, Dornish cavalry, and levies from smaller houses. Ser Brenner's force was nearby, awaiting the king's arrival. The stage seemed set for a confrontation. The hush before the storm pressed on everyone's nerves. As Sandor's host drew closer, they encountered trickles of refugees fleeing the area, peasants worried about another war ravaging their lands. Women with children, old men leaning on staffs, donkey carts piled high with meager possessions. Sandor ordered his men not to impede their passage. Yet the sight of frightened peasants stirred a memory in him, recalling how the War of the Five Kings had left so many dead or displaced. He had never considered himself a man of mercy, but some nights the faces of those he had seen suffer haunted him. Now here they were again under his watch, running from a new conflict. He set his jaw and pressed on. 5 days later, they reached the outskirts of the valley. From a ridge, Sandor looked down on what had become a gathering storm of armed men. Ser Brenner's camp lay on one side, Myrcella's on the other, separated by a stream winding through tall grass. Tents fluttered in a light autumn wind. The silhouette of Casterly Rock loomed in the distance, a massive bulk of stone dominating the horizon. Even from here, the red banners with the golden lion could be glimpsed on the fortress walls, remnants of old Lannister heraldry that Sandor's men had not replaced, perhaps out of grudging respect for tradition or out of fear of stirring local anger. The king's arrival swelled the crown's numbers to a formidable total, nearly matching Myrcella's if he combined his host with Brenner's. Within hours, the two loyal forces coordinated, constructing a broad encampment. Patrols were sent out to prevent surprise attacks, while Sandor consulted with Brenner in a large command tent. The tension was palpable. Outside, men sharpened swords, repaired armor, and whispered about what might happen when the sun rose. Brenner summarized the situation. Myrcella's not attempting to hide. She's pitched her camp openly. Some lords from the Westerlands are riding in daily to swear fealty to her. Others are staying out of it. She's asked for a parley, saying she'll meet you on the field tomorrow morning if you're willing. Sandor's lip curled. A parley. She wants to talk while she sits on claimed territory. Fine, let her talk. But if she thinks she can lecture me on who belongs on that damn throne, she's mistaken. Brenner gave a weary sigh. We might at least see what she has to say, if it prevents bloodshed. Sandor silenced him with a gloved hand raised. We'll go to parley, but we'll take enough men to be sure she doesn't try anything. The following morning, dawn broke over the valley in a swirl of mist. On a small flat stretch of grass between the two camps, a handful of banners marked a meeting point. Sandor approached with a contingent of horsemen, 50 strong, while Myrcella arrived from the opposite side, accompanied by a retinue of Dornish knights and a few Westerland's bannermen. Both sides halted a short distance apart. Archers and mounted scouts watched from afar, ensuring no trickery. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew and tension. Sandor dismounted, removing his helm to reveal the burned half of his face, hair shot with threads of gray near the temples. He stepped forward alone, letting his men hang back. Myrcella did the same, revealing a young woman of perhaps 17 or 18, golden-haired, with poise that belied her age. She wore a breastplate engraved with a hybrid sigil, the lion and stag of Baratheon Lannister, quartered with the spear of Martell. She looked at Sandor with an expression that held no fear but a hint of sorrow. "Lord Clegane," she said, voice quiet but carrying. "Thank you for meeting me." "King Clegane," he corrected, voice rumbling. She inclined her head, acknowledging the tension. "You sit the throne by force," she said, "and perhaps you believe that is all it takes to be king. But we need not fight. If you relinquish your claim and recognize mine, I promise you leniency and a place of honor in the new court. The realm has seen enough bloodshed." Sandor's eyes narrowed. Her tone was calm, measured, not the frantic shouting he remembered from Cersei or Joffrey. In many ways, that made it more dangerous. "You dare to lecture me on bloodshed?" he said. "Your mother's wars drowned this realm in blood. I ended her rule." Myrcella's expression wavered. "I know what my mother did. I do not condone all of it. But I am not her, nor am I Joffrey. The throne is mine by right, not yours. The realm needs stability and a leader who won't bring the sword down on anyone who disagrees. Step aside, and I'll spare your men." Sandor let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You think you can wave a parchment of lineage at me and I'll give up? I've been fighting for my life since I was a boy. You want this realm to be better? Then you start by not plunging it back into war. Turn your men around. Go home to Dorne or wherever you want. If you do, I'll let you live." His tone was flat, as if he were discussing a matter of cattle theft. She studied him, neither flinching nor fawning. "Men follow you out of fear, not love," she said. "You may keep them in line for a while, but what happens when you are gone? If we fight, many innocents will die. The Seven Kingdoms deserve better." A flicker of regret moved across Sandor's scarred face, but it was gone in an instant. "I'm giving them better than your mother or your brother ever did," he snapped. "Let's not pretend we can avoid bloodshed if you keep pretending you're queen." Her pale cheeks flushed. "You forget I have the support of Dorne and some of the Westerlands. The realm might accept me more readily than they ever accepted you." The morning air seemed to tighten. Sandor's men behind him shifted, hands on their sword hilts. Myrcella's retinue stood poised, equally on edge. A single wrong word could trigger violence. Sandor took a step closer to Myrcella, speaking quietly enough that only she and perhaps one or two from each side could hear. "You were a girl I once saw in the Red Keep," he said, voice almost gentler. "You had none of your brother's cruelty. I don't want to kill you, but make no mistake. I will if you force me. Think of the small folk. Think of the innocents who'll die if we turn this field red. For what? A piece of metal twisted into a throne." Myrcella's throat bobbed, but she met his gaze. "You're the one refusing a peaceful resolution. I've offered you a seat, offered to spare your men. It's you who clings to power, King Clegane." He let out a low snarl. "You don't know the first thing about me." Silence loomed between them, heavy as an executioner's blade. At length, she exhaled, her composure rallying. "If you will not yield, then we have nothing more to say. The next time we meet, it will be on the battlefield." Sandor nodded grimly. "So be it." She stepped back, returning to her horse without another word. Her knights fell in around her, and they rode off in a swirl of dust. The Hound stood there for a moment, gazing at her retreating form, imagining what sort of queen she might have been if fate had not intervened. Then he turned, stalking back to his horse. His men parted before him, faces sober. No one needed to ask what had been said. They could see the finality in their king's stance. Back in his command tent, Sandor and Brenner conferred. A handful of captains gathered around the map. They exchanged glances that spoke of the grim truth. War was upon them. Myrcella was not bluffing. She'd come too far, gathered too many supporters to simply abandon her claim. And the Hound would not relinquish the throne he had won through blood. The next dawn would bring the inevitable. Sandor took one last walk among his soldiers that night. Fires crackled. Men hunched over bowls of stew, tension coiling in their voices. Some recognized him immediately, bowing or saluting. Others darted nervous glances at his scarred visage. A few told him they would follow him anywhere, that they believed in what he had done for the realm. Others simply swallowed their fear, aware that the king's presence was not an invitation for casual banter. Sandor found himself recalling the earliest days of his campaign, when he was just a burned man with a sword, wandering the riverlands, never dreaming he might wear a crown. How far he had come, and how far he had yet to fall, perhaps. He returned to his tent, sank onto a stool, and let out a weary breath. War again. He pictured Myrcella's determined face. A part of him felt an odd pang of regret. Maybe if the realm had known kinder times, she might have made a decent ruler, or at least a gentler one. But Sandor had seen too much, done too much, to allow someone else to tear down what little order he'd achieved. There would be no second guesses. When dawn's early light broke over the valley, it found both armies preparing for battle. Trumpets sounded, commands echoed, banners unfurled. On one side flew the black standard of the Hound, on the other the golden lion merged with the stag and the martel spear. Lines of infantry formed, archers took positions on slight rises, cavalry massed on the flanks. The murmur of thousands of men and women at arms filled the air, accompanied by the whinny of horses and the metallic rattle of armor. Sandor rode along the front, battered helm under his arm, scanning the disciplined ranks of his men. They were not the polished host of the old kings, but they were well-blooded, loyal, and hardened by the rigors of his rule. Across the stream, Myrcella's forces lined up under a crisp banner. He glimpsed flashes of silver and gold, the polished plate of Westerland knights, the bright silks of Dornish lancers. In the center, a figure in shining armor, surely Myrcella, sat atop a white mare. For an instant, the morning sun caught the gold of her hair, making it glow like a halo. Then the light shifted, and the illusions vanished. The horns sounded. Orders went out. Slowly, methodically, both armies advanced. Sandor pulled on his hound's head helm, the metal muzzle gleaming, and lifted his sword. The memory of flames danced at the edges of his mind, but he kept it at bay. This was what he knew. This was how he would keep his throne, by steel and blood, the same way he had taken it. In the hush before the final clash, as the two armies closed the distance, Sandor let out a deep breath. He thought of the small folk, the realm, the throne that had weighed on him so heavily. Then his horse pounded forward, and he raised his blade, roaring the charge. The clash of armies thundered through the valley, and the dance of death began. Spears thrust, swords rang, arrows hissed overhead. The ground churned to mud under the stamping of countless feet. Men screamed in fury and in agony. The Hound's cavalry slammed into the right flank of Myrcella's line, smashing through hastily raised spears. Dust and blood filled the air, the sun glinting off every reflective surface until it seemed the earth itself was ablaze. Sandor cut down a knight bearing a golden lion on his shield, then wheeled his mount to parry a blow from a Dornish lancer. He bellowed commands for his men to press the advantage. On the far side, Myrcella's center advanced steadily, disciplined despite the chaos. He saw the flash of her white mare among the ranks, guarded by skilled knights. They crashed into the king's infantry, and the lines became a maelstrom of clanging steel and spattering gore. Hours blurred by in waves of violence. Sandor lost count of how many men he slew or how many times he nearly took a spear in the side. His men gave as good as they got, but Myrcella's forces were fiercely motivated, determined not to break. Ser Brenner led a charge on the left, attempting to outflank the Dornish cavalry. The scene was a tapestry of swirling chaos, impossible to fully control. Gradually, the Hound's greater numbers told. Bit by bit, Myrcella's lines began to fray. Some of her lesser bannermen, seeing the tide turning, pulled back. Others fought to the death out of loyalty or desperation. The ground was soon littered with corpses, the stream running red with blood. Sandor's horse, wounded, stumbled, pitching him off into the churned earth. He rose, muddy and bleeding from a shallow cut on his forearm. Gripping his sword two-handed, he roared for the nearest men to follow him. They surged forward, pushing through a battered cluster of Westerland knights. Then, through the haze of battle, he saw her. Myrcella sat astride her white mare, sword in hand, flanked by a small knot of her personal guard. Her face was etched with horror and determination. She spotted the Hound, recognized the black-helmed shape, and angled her horse toward him, as if drawn by fate. Her guard tried to dissuade her, but she urged her mare on, brandishing the weapon in a trembling grip. Sandor advanced, menacing, sword raised. He was a towering figure in smoke-blackened steel, blood dripping from the serrated edge of his blade. Around them, the fighting raged on, but this moment belonged to the two of them. Myrcella's eyes shone with tears, her expression a mix of fear, resolve, and sorrow for the men dying around her. She dismounted, perhaps fearing the horse would hamper her. Her guard scrambled to form a protective ring, but the Hound's own men pressed in, leading to a swirling melee. Steel bit steel, men shouted and screamed. In the midst of that chaos, Myrcella and the Hound faced each other. She lunged, her sword aimed at a gap in his armor. He parried easily, strength far surpassing hers. She stumbled but recovered, trying again. There was desperation in her sword work. She was no novice, but she was not the match of the Hound, a man forged by decades of brutal combat. Their swords rang together once, twice. Sandor battered aside her blade, nearly disarming her. She gasped for breath. "Stop, please," she managed. "It doesn't have to end like this." His voice, muffled by the Hound's head helm, came out rough as gravel. "You think I want to kill you?" He knocked her sword wide, forcing her to stagger back. "You're forcing my hand." He swung hard, aiming for her shoulder, but she twisted aside at the last instant. The blow glanced off her pauldron, sending her sprawling in the mud. She tried to rise, but he pressed his blade to her throat. In that heartbeat, the battle around them seemed to fade, as if only they existed in the torn grass, surrounded by moans of the dying. Myrcella stared up, face streaked with blood and tears. "If you kill me, the fighting won't stop," she whispered. "You'll make me a martyr. Others will rise." Sandor stood there, panting, sword trembling a fraction. 1,000 thoughts flashed through his mind. His old grudges, the promise he'd made to dethrone the Lannisters, the realm's desire for an end to war, the image of Sansa's gentle face, Arya's fierce eyes, all those who had suffered under the Lannisters. He could end Myrcella's claim with a single thrust. But would that truly end the unrest, or would it stoke the flames? His men hovered, unsure whether to intervene. Myrcella's guard lay slain or captured nearby. The clang of steel continued in patches around the field as pockets of resistance clung to life. Overhead, crows circled, drawn by the scent of carrion. Sandor felt his breath ragged. Slowly, he lowered his sword a hair. "Yield," he growled. "Yield, and I'll spare you." She looked at him, eyes wide, chest heaving. There was a flicker of relief, of hope. Then she bowed her head. "I yield." The words came haltingly, as though they cost her everything. He stepped back, motioning for two of his knights to seize her arms. "Lock her in irons," he ordered, voice flat. "Keep her safe. No harm." They dragged Myrcella to her feet, snapping manacles around her wrists. She stared at Sandor, trembling, but alive. The rest of her forces, seeing their would-be queen captured, began to break in earnest. Some surrendered, others fled in every direction. A handful fought on futilely, preferring death to defeat. The field belonged to the Hound. Just like that, the last threat to his throne was undone, or so it seemed. Yet the cost lay all around. Hundreds if not thousands of corpses, many wearing black hound sigils, others wearing lions, stags, and sun spears. A sour taste choked Sandor's throat. He felt no triumph, only the heavy weight of another war, another massacre. Myrcella's words lingered. If you kill me, the fighting won't stop. But he had not killed her. Would that choice haunt him, or would it offer some small chance at preventing further bloodshed? As dusk fell on the valley, the king's men gathered the wounded, burned the dead, and set up torches around the makeshift camp that now extended over the battlefield. Myrcella was taken to a stout pavilion, guarded by 4 knights who kept watch around the clock. The field reeked of gore, and the crows feasted. Sandor walked among the moaning wounded, directing his men to bring water, to fetch the maesters. He tried to quell the anger he felt at the needless loss of life. Yet that anger had no single target. It was the cost of crowns and thrones, the unstoppable machine of ambition and fear. When morning came, the remnants of Myrcella's army had either fled or been captured. The king's standard flew triumphant. Still, the aftermath of the battle was no cause for celebration. Soberly, Sandor surveyed the battered knights, the exhausted foot soldiers. Ser Brenner approached him, saluting, face grim. "We found Tristain Martel among the dead," he said quietly. "Their betrothal ends here." Sandor's gaze swept the carnage. What of the Dornish? How many fled? Some surrendered, others scattered. Brenner hesitated. They may carry word of her capture back to Dorne. That could provoke the Martells. Sandor gave a short nod. He should have expected as much. Another potential spark of conflict. "We'll deal with that if it comes." Brenner studied him, Arlie cautious about raising the next subject. "And what will you do with Myrcella?" The king dragged a gauntlet hand over his scarred face. He had no appetite for regicide, nor did he want to keep her around as a perpetual source of rebellion. Nor could he simply let her go free. Cersei was still in his dungeons, and now her daughter would join her in captivity. Perhaps forever. "I'll take her back to King's Landing in chains," he said, voice low and grim. "But I'll keep her alive. I'm not about to make her a martyr." He paused, considering. If Dorne or any Lannister loyalists want to keep fighting over her, they'll have to consider the cost. Brenner inclined his head, though his eyes flickered with a shade of pity. "As you command, Your Grace." The day wore on as the army gathered itself, burying friends, burning enemies, sorting captives. The realm had once again been soaked in blood over the question of who sat a throne of swords. Myrcella's short-lived rebellion was over, but the echoes of it would carry across Westeros. What would Dorne do? Would the Westerlands remain tame now that another Lannister had been defeated? In the following weeks, as Sandor's battered host returned east with Myrcella in irons, scattered attempts at resistance cropped up in the Westerlands. Small pockets of diehards who refused to accept the outcome. But with Myrcella herself a prisoner, they lacked a rallying figure and soon went underground. The Dornish who had joined her cause largely withdrew, angry and humiliated. Sandor left a decent-sized garrison in Casterly Rock and other key strongholds to ensure no further uprisings. He assigned local lords who had sworn fealty to keep watch over the region. There was a worry that blood feuds might linger, that families who lost relatives in the battle would yearn for revenge. But for now, the Hound was victorious, unchallenged once more. When he finally rode through the gates of King's Landing, a hush fell over the crowds that gathered. They saw the king's procession, the tattered banners, the weary soldiers, and, at the center, the defeated princess in chains. Some spat at her, blaming her for the war. Others gazed upon her with quiet sympathy, remembering Myrcella as the polite child of the Red Keep. Myrcella herself rode on a horse with her wrists bound, flanked by knights who made sure she could not escape. Her face was pale, eyes distant, as if she were somewhere far away in her mind. In the throne room, Sandor ordered she be taken to a secure chamber rather than the black cells. He might be a brute, but he was not blind to the fact that Myrcella was no monster. Her cause had led to bloodshed, yes, but her personal cruelty was nowhere near that of her brother or mother. She would remain a prisoner until the king decided otherwise. Cersei, learning that her daughter was in the castle, raged to see her. She demanded an audience, demanded mercy for her innocent girl. Sandor ignored these pleas. He had no desire to reunite mother and daughter. Myrcella was stripped of her titles, her regalia, and now she was simply another captive. Perhaps, Sandor mused, if the day came when she truly repented her claim and posed no threat, he might release her or exile her. But that day was far off. Time passed. The city recovered from its partial mustering. The realm took a wary breath, waiting to see if Dorne would retaliate. Reports from the south suggested the Martells were furious, but their position was uncertain. King Sandor sent envoys with stern warnings. Any Dornish incursion would be met with force. He reminded them that their princess's betrothed had died on the battlefield, and that continuing the fight would gain them nothing. For now, Dorne held back, sullen but not ready for another war. The Westerlands, forcibly pacified, began to grudgingly accept the Hound's rule. Anything to avoid more fighting. In the Red Keep, day-to-day governance resumed. The small folk took some solace in the fact that the war had been short. While it cost many lives, at least it had not dragged on for years. Still, the realm bore new scars. Families had lost sons, daughters, fathers. Sandor found himself presiding over an endless stream of compensation requests, petitions, and disputes stemming from the conflict. Peace was a fragile thing, prone to cracks in every corner of the kingdom. And what of Myrcella herself? Locked in a tower room with shuttered windows, she sank into a quiet despair. Occasionally, a septa was allowed to visit her for prayers, or a maester to check her health. She ate little, spoke less. Some said she simply stared at the walls, replaying the violence of the battlefield in her mind. The realm's dream of a gentler queen had withered in the mud of that valley, still alive but effectively silenced. King Sandor, meanwhile, tried not to dwell on her. He had no regrets about capturing rather than killing her. If anything, he found himself relieved that the realm did not have another corpse around which the discontented could rally. Yet at times, in the dead of night, the memory of her tear-filled eyes haunted him. Another war had been waged, more men had died. Also, he could cling to a seat he never wanted in his youth. The wheel kept turning, and he was merely the strongest beast yoked to it. As the hush of autumn settled in, life trudged on. The king handled his duties with the same gruff determination as ever. The people of King's Landing learned to fear and respect his justice. The lords of Westeros, exhausted from war, bent the knee or kept their distance. Banditry remained low, the roads safer than they had been. Taxes were collected, crops harvested, commerce cautiously revived. For a realm so often fractured by conflict, that alone was something of a small miracle. Yet in dark taverns and quiet corners, whispers persisted. Some said that if Myrcella survived, so did the Lannister line's claim, and that one day she might escape or be freed. Others said that House Martell would surely bide its time, waiting for a chance to avenge their dead prince. Still others muttered about the north, about rumors of undead in the snow. But for now, none of these concerns outweighed the simple relief of an uneasy peace. And Sandor Clegane, the burned dog who had seized a kingdom with savage force, continued to rule. A reluctant monarch bound by duty and fury, haunted by ghosts of the past and uncertain of the future. He had crushed another pretender. The Iron Throne, with all its jagged edges, remained his seat. The realm, scarred and weary, bent under his authority like a beaten cur. Whether it was truly tamed or just waiting for the next bloodletting, only time would tell. And in Westeros, time was seldom kind. In the waning light of each evening, as the sun set behind the Red Keep's towers, King Sandor would often stand on a balcony high above the city, peering out toward the horizon where troubles always seemed to loom. The faint cries of gulls echoed from Blackwater Bay, and the distant haze of memory tugged at him like an old wound. He'd grip the stone railing, scowl against the biting wind, and remind himself of the vow he once made in the quiet of his own mind. Never again would he let the realm be ruled by those who cared nothing for its people. A vow that had brought him here, to this monstrous seat, and that still chained him to its responsibilities. Few understood the burden that weighed on him, the fear that he might become the very sort of tyrant he once despised. Yet night after night, he remained, unyielding, a scarred sentinel over a battered kingdom, the dog still guarding the gate. In a land that yearned for heroes but often found only monsters, Sandor Clegane might have been the closest thing to salvation they were ever going to get, even if it came with a blade and a growl, and even if the final price had not yet been paid.